Okay, I might need a drink after this one. This is the video I've been dreading because there's so much you got to know between the FRT-3 models, which is the second generation Floyd Rose model made before Kramer Guitars when Floyd Rose was contracted out with Fernandez of Japan. This is also by far the most confusing model because this is when Japan really started to crank out a bunch of clones to compete with them. And because Floyd Rose was contracted with Fernandez, who was based in Japan, a lot of the factories who were making the real Floyd Roses, they kind of like decided to do their own thing. And you see a lot of clones that people think are like rare prototypes and all that, but not necessarily. It's just a clone made in some factory in Japan. However, some of the factories likely made the real Floyds, except they kind of cheapened them up a little bit and made them out of the brass. So let's start with the main official Floyd Rose models. It's easier to understand the FRT-3 when you know what the real models are. So if you guys have not watched FRT-1 videos in the Floyd Rose series, go back and watch these. I'll kind of give a little brief history here. So Floyd Rose, the first production model you could ever buy was called the FRT-1. You could buy it around 1980. And then he redesigned it and into the FRT-3, which is what these are. This is like the second generation non-fine tuning Floyd Rose model. And he made some USA versions in his basement, but they're mixed with some Japanese stuff. And then also the Japanese really got running cranking these out, okay? This is all before Kramer Guitars, keep that in mind. So here are the main models you gotta understand. So the first one we call is the USA FRT-3. These ones, they're very similar. The base plate's just like the USA FRT ones, but the saddles are now cast. And these are believed to be made by the Japanese Fernandez at some unknown factory, and they shipped them to Floyd, supposedly. So it's the USA version, however, the saddles are likely Japanese in it. Okay? I'm going to get to more of the identifying features a little later. And then Japan, Floyd Rose sent like lost wax casting versions of it. He sent them over to Fernandez Japan, and then they started creating their own version of it. And these no logo ones are called the Japanese no logo prototype FRT-3s. These are made in Fernandez Japan. We don't know what factory, but these are the earliest ones. And then they actually put the stamp on them. So the Japanese FRT-3 models, as a fun fact, are the very first ever Floyd Roses to have the Floyd Rose stamp on them. That's a little fun fact. They usually look like this, but there's like a mistaken batch or early batch where they actually reversed the Floyd Rose logo. That's what this one is, okay? So these three are Japanese. This is the USA one, which is all USA except the saddles that were likely made in early version of Fernandez Japan. They're cast. Now, there's also the German FRT-3. This is when this is when Floyd Rose made it big. He's with Kramer Guitars. And this is German. Schaller made these, okay? These are very different than the Japanese versions and the USA ones, but it's good to know the differences. These ones are mainly put on like Kramer Focus guitars, and they weren't really sought after. People wanted the fine-tuned models, but it's good to know that there are like basically 3 to 4 main models you got to know about, okay? There are also some clones you have to know about. And I'm going to make a whole separate video on this. But basically, right, these factories in Japan were making the real Floyd Roses, FRT-3s. If you didn't know, the Japanese were very, very, very good at cloning things very fast. And they're actually one of the first to make the clones or replicas of the FRT-3s. And you can see these a lot in the Japanese market, and some of them you can find in America. So the most popular one is called this one. It's called the Double Eagle FRT-3. This one, I believe, was made in the same factories that made the real FRT-3s because the base plates they're almost identical, but the saddles are different. And the big difference between these ones are they're made out of brass. So like the real Floyds are brass. The real Floyds are made out of steel, right? And these are made out of brass, which is a softer metal. Same with the saddles. If you put a magnet to them, they're not magnetic because brass is non-magnetic. So it's just a cost saving measure, but they are chrome plated. So we call this a double eagle FRT-3. One big thing is you can tell the difference is why it's a clone is they got like a black painted brass sustain block. That's a key feature of a clone. This one we called the Brachus FRT-3, or I don't know what factory made these, but these are found in like a lot of Japanese guitars called Brachus, and these ones are a little different than these ones. These are ESP contracted this factory who make them. These are actually made out of steel, but these are pretty different than both the double eagle ones and the real FRT-3s. We call this one the Brian Guitars clone. This one's really similar to the double eagle one, but has different saddles. They're flat. And then we call this one the ESP FRT-3. This one is very similar to this Brachus, however you say it, clone, and made out of steel. And you find this on a lot of ESP navigators. More on this later. So the USA FRT-3, this is kind of the first one. This one, the base plates were made at Floyd's basement. It's made out of bent steel. It has a lot of similar characteristics to the USA FRT-1. It's got the brass intonation screw holes. The intonation screw holes are further back than the Japanese version. These are cast saddles, though, probably made by the Japanese, not milled like the FRT-1 saddles. Another thing is the bass side is a little longer than the Japanese knife edge point. Also, you have the stickers on here that said, these are the Rose USA stickers that you find in the USA sustain blocks. It's like I see a good mix of red and blue. Sometimes they are red ink. This one has blue ink. Also, these had imperial measurements as an inches measurement, not metric like the Japanese ones. The locking nut is also milled. You can see here. Here's another example. This guy was from Japan. He bought this from Floyd Rose at the NAMM booth, I think, in 1982 in Atlanta, Georgia. So it's pretty. This is a USA one, and you can see the characteristics. It's got the Rose USA on the sustain block. The sustain block is made out of hot rolled steel. This is not paint; it's mill scale, and it's slanted right there. So yeah, with the USA ones, it's so it's got the imperial measurements. This edge, this corner here, the knife edge, it's a little different. The base plates are different than the Japanese ones by a little bit, and the intonation screw holes are a little further back. I kind of talk about this more in the USA FRT-1 video as well. So the Japanese FRT-3s, official ones, the very first ones were no logo. As you can see, the edge right here of the knife edge, it's a little shorter, not as long as the USA ones. The intonation screw holes are further back than the USA ones. These are all metric measurements, usually a 6mm trem bar. Cast saddles, they're a little more polished and cleaned up than the earlier USA ones. So these saddles, I believe the Japanese made these saddles and sent them to Floyd, and then they kind of refined it so they're not as rough looking as the USA ones. And these have the stainless steel hex screws. They had a gold version. The earliest ones had chrome plating on the insert blocks. Like this is probably like 82. This is like 83. And in 1984, they didn't chrome plate it. They were black. So that's how you date the years. So the no logo Japanese prototype version these had bigger sustain blocks, a little thicker, and this one had a slant on there. And the production ones had there's huge thick ones and they're flat on the top. And the stickers on these say Floyd Rose. They don't have Rose on there, so these are the Japanese stickers. And here's an example of one that Floyd Rose was selling these too, okay? People don't understand that. Like, you know, Fernandez was probably shipping him a bunch of stuff, right? And so he would sell the Japanese ones at his shop. Why wouldn't he when he's got them doing all the work, right? And why would he waste time if making them? Here's one that 1983, Floyd Rose, Japan, that this guy got it from Floyd Rose, actually. The sticker right here said the red ink. Say Floyd Rose tremolo system, not just Rose tremolos. This one's signed by Floyd Rose. Sometimes they have made in Japan on the bottom of them too. I have seen one case where it said this ink and it says made in Japan. As you can see, you got the humpback locking nuts. The Japanese posts usually had a Phillips, not a flathead screw top. You first see them in the 1983 catalog. The Japanese supposedly made these, so the USA ones probably were made in like late 81, right around there, and then the Japanese probably started producing them in like 82 sometime. Brad Gillis had him on his Fernandez guitars. That's where you see him a lot. A lot of people thought Eddie Van Halen had an FRT-3, but I had never found a picture of him with one. People thought this was an FRT-3, but it's not. It's an FRT-1 that's been confirmed. So just want to let you guys know that. Eddie, he was one of the first users, so he used the FRT-1s, and then he went straight to the FRT-4. He is never seen with an FRT-3. Did he have some around? Probably, but he's never pictured with one. Vinnie Vincent's another one that likes to use them. He had a USA one on a Charvel guitar he had, and then also on his V guitars he has a Japanese version. He actually prefers these. Some videos of him playing it. Still playing it today. Here's the Japanese one. This is a recent photo of Vinny. Here's another picture of one. Here's Brad Gillis with his Fernandez guitar. He had a black Japanese FRT-3 on them. Here he is playing live. Well, I think he put the FRT-1s on his live guitars today. Fernandez threw him on a lot of the guitars at that time, especially in '83. You'd see him a lot. Here's a photo of Fernandez. Here's Floyd Rose pictured in a Japanese magazine. This is pretty interesting. Here's Floyd Rose at the Fernandez booth. I think this is 1982 Atlanta. He's kind of talking about the Floyd Rose system. A lot of people had no idea about this Fernandez history, by the way. Like, there's still people that can disbelieve. Like, they're like, what do you mean he was never with Fernandez? Yes, like, here's the evidence here. Like, it's kind of a secret history. Everyone thinks like it was just Kramer and that's it. There's a whole secret history before that. And here is Floyd Rose talking about the Floyd Rose at this Japanese magazine. And look, my guess is he's at the 1982 Summer NAMM show in Atlanta, Georgia, I think. Kind of talking about it, yeah. Pretty cool. Here's some identification. I kind of talked about this earlier, right? The post right here, so that's a little longer. The intonation screw hole's a little further back. It's all imperial measurements in inches, not metric. The earlier ones, the prototype, you can see there's these two from the casting process. You can see these little notches are a little higher on the saddles here. In the later production versions, they polish that out a little more. You don't see that, but the early versions, like on the USA ones and the no-logo Japanese ones, the Japanese must not have refined that yet, so you can see that, okay? And these are brass intonation. You could put a socket wrench on here and adjust the intonation, the saddle back and forth once it's still locked down. If you just loosen this a little bit and you can move it back and forth. You don't see that in any modern Floyds anymore. Here's an example of a gold one. This guy supposedly got it from Floyd's garage. You can see how the casting was pretty rough then. You could really see the casting marks on these. It's an earlier one. This one has the thicker sustained block. This sustained block, I believe, that's Japan. I think by then the Japanese were sending him a bunch of stuff, right? Here's the no logo Japanese one. As you can see, like we kind of talked about before, it's a little shorter at the stub. The intonation screw holes are further forward. It's got the same casting as a lot of other things. Yeah, the sticker right here. Like I said, it's all metric, right? I kind of talk about these details here. There's a reverse logo one. The F is closer to the knife edge. And I think that, I don't know if they messed that up or they intentionally tried to do that, or like this is the first batch where they tried to put the logo on. And the problem with this way is that when you play the guitar sideways, right, it's upside down if you're a right-handed guitarist. So that's why they flipped it around and the F is over here then, right? The production FRT-3s, you can see they kind of polished up the saddles a little bit more. And then the insert blocks were chromed, or in this case, gold. The gold plating on the Japanese ones didn't last very long on these. They kind of faded over the years. So here's an 83 with chrome inserts, right? More polished, the way the casting processes. The base plates are bent steel, by the way. What I mean by that, it's a plate, and they actually bent up this tailpiece right here. They bent it up to put, and they drilled the screws through holes. So these weren't cast. The saddles are cast, but not the base plate. But yeah, it's in 84. You can see these are black insert blocks. That's what you can tell. It's an 84, 85. And then these are the German FRT-3s. These are basically very, very, very different than the Japanese ones, but they're also really good, high quality. They don't get a lot of respect because when these were produced, everyone wanted this is when Kramer guitars were around, right? And everyone wanted the, fine-tuning version. So people, they kind of chucked these to the side. They didn't care about them because they're on the Focus and Striker guitars, but these are actually really good tremolos. They're built really well. And very different than the Japanese ones, though. Yeah, so you can see them on a lot of the Focus guitars. So these are the clones. This is where it gets tricky, okay? Because the problem with these clones, now they're really cool, these clones. They're one of the very first ever copies or clones of a Floyd Rose ever. They're really neat, actually. But the problem with these are people think, they're all prototypes. Eddie Van Halen must have had this one, So when people see these, if you don't really know the history of Floyd Rose, you think it's like some holy grail of whatever, when in reality it's just a Floyd Rose clone, okay? And based in Japan. That's what the Japanese did. Like they were good at making clones. So this is called the Double Eagle one. The telltale sign of these with a lot of the Japanese clones are the sustain blocks. It's got like a glossy black paint on them, and usually they were brass. And in fact, the base plate and the saddles were also brass. If you take a magnet to them, they won't stick to it because they're non-magnetic. However, they are chrome plated, so people don't really notice that. So, and they did that as a cost-saving measure. So they tried to cut, they were like 1/3 of the price of the Floyd Rose, and they did that by making it brass, so it's softer, it doesn't last as long. But these are pretty cool, actually. So this is what we call the Double Eagle. And you can see them a lot of guitars in Japan, a bunch of random stuff. However, you could buy them supposedly from the Venom and Music catalog. So how to tell they're a clone. So this thing, the glossy black sustain block, that's brass. Also, take a magnet to the base plate. It's brass, and the saddles are brass. Also, the sometimes on these, they had an indent on where the screw holes for the intonation saddles are. That's another one. Also, the saddles are a little different on these. They don't have the cast marks as the official Floyds, and they kind of have the semicircle thing going on to them. It's funny because the factory that actually built the real Floyds, they probably had a role in these too, right? Floyd Rose, he's in America, he doesn't know what's going on, and they're making it, and they said, why don't we make money on the side? I think these base plates for sure are most likely made by the factory that made the real Floyds, but they're made out of brass, which is not a stronger good, right? And these saddles, who knows what factories were involved? There's probably Takeuchi, Goto. There was a place in Kyoto, Japan, and a place in Korea, and they all kind of, I think one company made the sustain blocks and whatever. We don't really know what factories were involved, but these are clones, not really official Floyd Roses, okay? You see these in like a lot of Matsumoto guitars is what I notice. And sometimes the saddles vary in size, but you can see one common theme is that glossy black paint. That's brass. That's a telltale sign of a clone, right? And they got this, and they got that. The same company that made the real steel ones probably made these too, but they're cheaper because they're made out of brass. It's easier to mill all that stuff. So yeah, that's a telltale sign with that. This one's called the Brian clone, and again, we call it the Brian clone. We don't know what factory made these, but it's got the same base plate as like the Double Eagle one. But this one, the saddles are different. They don't have that hump on them. They kind of have this recess, bullet style recess, but there's no hump right here. And for some reason, you usually see these on these Brian guitars, which was a store model. So in Japan, like the guys would take parts from all these factories and do their own store models and sell them as, like in this case, a Brian guitar. So this was really common, and so you see these on a lot of those. This one's got the brass base plate, brass saddles, right? So it's made cheaper. Sometimes the screws are a little different. It's got like the rounded screws on these ones. Another thing with the Double Eagle and this Brian one are the trem bars are made out of steel, not stainless steel like the official ones, and so they kind of rust a little bit more. And I actually like them a little better. They're a little longer than the official Floyd Floyd Rose ones. So yeah, here's the way you could tell the black paint, base plates, brass, right? Take a magnet to it. And here it is. I mean, you can find these in literature, right? You can so here it's a Floyd Rose type. It's a 15,000 yen. They're like a third of the price of the real Floyd Rose. They say there are types. When they say type, that's a clone. Here's evidence that they are types, right? Like, it's good to know that because, again, a lot of people think these are like super ultra rare prototypes that you can never find. And a person who won't know a lot about the research in Floyd's would think that because that's, because they looked apart, but they're not, right? You got to know the Japanese made clones. That's just what they did. I'm not knocking them or anything. These are actually really cool. They're like the first ever Floyd Rose clones, and they're really awesome. And actually, they're really good trims. I like using them, but just be aware they're not really official Floyds from what we know, and they're very different. I mean, they're made out of brass, right? And they're clones types. Here's a Brian guitar with one right now. Here's one where the different set of cells are a little different on these, like go further, probably because they kind of had a little bit of hand milling going on, right? This is like 1982. This one's called, I'm not sure what factory made these, the Bracas. I think ESP contracted these ones. Now, these ones are a little better quality. These are made out of real steel, but the base plate and everything is a lot different than a regular official Floyd Rose and the Double Eagles. So the Double Eagles, like where it's bent right here, these ones aren't bent. Like they just kind of milled and it's kind of kept the tailpiece back right there. And the saddles are a lot different than the official ones. The knife edges are further back on these, but it is made out of steel. And they are magnetic. So this one's a little higher quality. You can see the mill marks in this one. Now this one has the painted black glossy thing as well, but this one's actually steel. But it still has that glossy things on them. I think ESP contracted these out. And here you see it right here as the type. This is the one right here. It's like third of the price of the real Floyd Rose right here. There's evidence right there. These are a little higher quality than the Double Eagles, I think. Speaking of which, the Double Eagles, they're found mainly in Japan, but you could buy them in the United States under the Venom and Music catalog, from what I've heard. Here's another example of this Bracas clone, or whatever it is, ESP. And I think, so this one was redeveloped, redefined into this ESP FRT-3. They're really similar. You can find these on ESP navigators a lot in that time. And they put the ESP on the base plate. Here's the one. See, the base plate's a little different on these. Here's the ESP logo. The tailpiece isn't bent up like the official Floyd Rose on these. Otherwise, they're relatively close. The FRT-3s had these same kind of style locking nuts. And it's been coming back because now with locking tuners like Guthrie Govan, he actually uses the German one, double locking one. And so it's kind of coming back, these FRT-3s. Back, the problem with these non-fine tuning ones is that when you clamp it, it goes out a sharper flat. So it's it's not easy to get it right, which is why the fine tuners were nice. But now guys with their locking tuners, they can, it's less of an issue. So yeah, hopefully that helped understand the FRT-3s a little bit more. That was a lot of information, and I could go on more and more, but let's just end it right there.